Um, so anybody ever heard of MapStory? Raise your hand. All right. So for those of you who haven't, mapstory.org, feel free to go. If you poke around it, where's that? You realize it's really not about real time, and it's about kind of the companion point that was made by the other panelists, which is, to really know what's going on right now, you need to understand kind of the previous change over time. And that's a theme that I'll touch upon a little bit here. But first, I will actually focus on real time, real space and time. So the first point I'd like to make, like a lot of people think this is, a brand new thing. The fact that you're getting tracked in space and time. We've entered, the realm of surveillance society. 2013 is really scary. I always like to point out that it's been going on a long time, and I'll have a talk tomorrow where I'll talk a bit about Napoleon. The reason he instituted a census and addresses and cadastre was so that he could actually know where every working age male was and manage his labor force and make sure they didn't migrate across his domain without his permission. So it's not like this is a new thing, it's just the technology continues to evolve. But in more recent times, I always like to point out credit bureaus. People are scared of the government tracking you. Don't be scared of the government tracking you. Be scared of the credit bureaus and the guys that actually know every single financial transaction you've ever engaged in, exactly where they are, what dollar amount it was for, and what the actual goods were. This has been done for, a good solid 2 decades with the rise of credit cards. And data warehousing, which is kind of almost a quaint term these days, but every one of these commercial enterprises that has data for their own internal reasons, accounts payable, billing, personnel, you name it, they have big data warehouses that let them deal with the entities and transactions. To them, you're just an entity that engages in transactions over time and space. And if anybody's ever heard of Jeff Jonas, anybody heard of Jeff? Ah, great. I'm giving you something new. I know you know him. So Jeff's kind of, it's actually, go to his blog, just type blog Jeff Jonas and read it. It's almost like mind candy. If you can find videos of them talking, it's great stuff. But Jeff cut his teeth building data warehouses for casinos, healthcare organizations, people with large amounts of cash flowing through, helping them find kind of the bad actors. And they were doing it in real time, because even in the 90s, they were trying to catch these guys to make sure the organization didn't get fleeced. And while they weren't really focused on space per se, they were parsing through all these entities and transactions. And I think it's important to realize this has been going on for a long time. The term he would use is channels and channel consolidation. When you engage in a transaction, you assume that it's with that organization and the information about this transaction isn't being shared. And that somehow you've separated your channels so you're safe. Turns out in the commercial space, they also either sell each other their data, cross-license their data, even if they say that they've anonymized it. That data, once it crosses channels and becomes consolidated, can easily be rejoined. So he's very focused on where does the data pool. AT&T, Verizon, I don't know who your particular wireless carrier is, has the heartbeat of your phone, right? Since the moment you actually got it from the store until now. They know every second of every day exactly where you've been, at least while the phone's turned on, right? They actually give that data away to marketing companies. They chop your name off of it, right? But so what? All you have to do is merge that with public records of who lives at what address and take the sleepy time where your phone 95% of the time is at your house and do a spatial join. It's actually really, really trivial. So channel consolidation is occurring all the time right now between all of these different pools of data that naturally occur because of your commercial or government, interface with your government, et cetera. So when those data pools mix, all sorts of crazy starts to happen. And as new technologies are coming out that let the data find the data, right? Find relationships between different kinds of data, whether it's just a spatial algorithm that will bring the two together, or some sort of a match merge process that takes your unique identifier, your frequent flyer number or your social security number, whatever it is, and join it to all the other records. It starts getting scary. And as I said before, with the mobile revolution, that gets even scarier. So back in the 1990s, it was one thing to say, I'm going to take all of the entity and transaction information across multiple enterprises. So take, for instance, we're being videotaped. Let's take a large commercial organization that may own a bunch of hotels, a bunch of rental cars, and a bunch of retail, right? But yet they have a common data warehouse. So they know where you stayed, where you rented cars, and where you bought stuff, all within one data warehouse, right? When they're able to actually purchase anonymized cell phone data, they can actually watch, how you traverse that whole thing, what Jeff would like to call space-time data. And then there's all that context data. I mentioned public record data. There's all these different things that aren't specifically about you. But the more you put that context data in, it provides all the puzzle pieces that lets you kind of solve the puzzle faster. And I think the biggest issue is the publicness of your space-time data. So Twitter is a really interesting example of something that by default is public, right? You are putting it out there for the entire world to see. There's lots of other things where the publicness is a bit more ambiguous. However, so-called anonymized versions of that data are being made available. So once you engage in channel consolidation, taking different pools of data and mixing it, turns out you're much more public than you thought you were in the beginning. So I always like to say, beware of what the economy will do to you before beware what your government will do to you. But let's look at what our government is geared up to do to other people outside our country. So we've got, over the past 10 years of war, have actually refined the concept of activity-based intelligence, where it's not just taking static intelligence from a couple of years ago and merging it with some other geographic information, et cetera, but actively monitoring the activity over a specific geography. We hone this particularly well in urban environments. You can read in all the magazines about the drones, et cetera, but particularly being able to dwell over a geography for a long period of time and persistently be able to watch everything move. We hear about signals intelligence, and then we don't talk about it much because it's classified, but intercepting signals over that same geography for which you have video. Radar, ground moving target indicators, is something that is out there in common parlance, but to actually, through active radar, be able to watch all the physical things move around. Laying down terrestrial sensor webs that may pick up on different things as they read, as they send out some sort of signal. Social media monitoring, right? So we're all that scary stuff you just saw with Twitter, right? And all of being able to see what your neighbors are doing, what they're tweeting, when they're tweeting it, are they inside of their house, outside of their house while they're tweeting it. That's just one layer in kind of the larger activity-based intelligence space. And then any other geolocated information you have, which may be old, maybe historic, maybe public record data, it could be credit records, I don't really care what it is. The notion of activity-based intelligence, where you're actually focused on people's activity and change over time, is something that's becoming quite a honed art in terms of what we're able to do, for good, bad, or indifferent. Talk about the cyber location nexus, where that's all in kind of real geographic space, but increasingly, all of your activity in cyberspace, because of the ubiquity of IP connectedness and the ubiquity of GPS. So increasingly, everything is going to be connected. Your refrigerator, and there will be a log that you opened your freezer at 11:30 and pulled out the chunky monkey, and that's kind of going to be there because it's connected IP-wise and connected GPS-wise. So it's actually going to be very difficult to distinguish what's been going on in cyberspace and what's going on in real-world geography. And I think, for a long time, people have talked about cyberspace as this otherworldly place where people do things to each other and it has no relationship to the real world. Increasingly, it's just, kind of a ubiquitous layer on top of a ubiquitous layer. So Kind of the point I started with is the point I'll end with, which is, to take society's pulse, I'll just use the pulse metaphor from a hospital or a doctor perspective, right? You don't take the pulse to know that right now the patient is healthy, or right now, the patient his pulse is high or low. You ask questions about the patient's medical history. You take all of his previous readings from the last 6 months, and 6 months before that, 6 months before that. Why do you do that, right? Because you want to know, is this historically high blood pressure, historically low blood pressure? Is it uptrend, downtrend? Is it spiking? What's going on? Because the person either came in with a complaint or said, I'm normal. So you're really trying to get context there. So you're not just taking the pulse to know, I have a pulse, he's alive, the heart is beating. And you're doing that, why? Not just to say you're healthy right now, but to achieve some sort of a prognosis. Not to predict, when the person's going to die or whatever, but you're actually taking the trend because, the most likely next dot in that trend is probably statistically correlated with other similar trends that have had similar behavior, that have a similar past, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think, the pulse metaphor is useful, but not just in the actual simple act of taking the pulse at the moment. So, it all comes down to a snapshot's less useful than understanding change over time, particularly across space. The appropriate time frame for understanding all this stuff and the appropriate temporal scale will actually change, not only depending on your analytic problem, but as that analytic problem evolves over time, your analytic scale will most likely change. So.